So one of the cool things about science are all the fun experiments and activities that you get to do. And in the virtual world, it's a little challenging, but we are going to do our best. But in order to understand the experiment, you have to remember science is chaotic, it's spontaneous, but at the same time, it has rules that it follows. It likes to have lists, like little check-off lists of things that it needs to do. And so we're going to look at like a little check-off list for when it comes to designing experiments. So when we look at biology, remember we're studying the diversity of life. And in doing so, we need to come up with solutions. And when we talk about problems doesn't mean something bad. Problems are questions that the person comes up with, and people try to figure out the answers to those questions. So what was devised is something called the scientific method. Now, whenever we do an experiment is a series of steps that a person does in order to try to solve a problem. It's a series of steps that a person does in order to get a question answered. And in that experiment, we gather data, we observe, we come up with questions, we come up with answers, and we see how close we are. Well, when we look at the scientific method is a very specific series of steps that one follows in order to do an experiment. And there's 7 parts to it. And so please make sure that you know these 7 parts in order. But with the scientific method, the very first thing that happens, observations. And observations, the formal definition is to identify a problem to solve by observing the world. Basically, an observation you've been doing your entire life. Okay? When you were little, you would ask your parents, why is the grass green? What makes the sky blue? What makes a rainbow? These are all problems. These are all questions that somebody had to take the time in order to solve. Now, when you were little and your mom and dad asked you about the rainbow, they might have just told you it was just a trick of the light on the water droplets in the air. Or when you asked your parents why was the sky blue, they might have just said because that's how nature made it. They didn't go into all the different particles floating in the atmosphere, and when the light hits them, it causes the light to bend and diffract, and that's just the color that shows up. Or, why is the sky blue sometimes, but then like at sunrise and sunset, it's pinks and yellows and purples. Well, those are all observations, and that's what gets experiments started. Somebody cared enough to want to figure out, okay, why is the sky blue? Or, okay, I'm gonna figure out what makes a rainbow. So with the scientific method, we always start off with observations of some type. Now, once we have our question, like, why is the sky blue? We then move into what's called a hypothesis. Now, a hypothesis, the formal definition, is an explanation of a problem that can be tested with an experiment. The general, more often used definition for an hypothesis is an educated guess. And so a lot of times when people say, what's a hypothesis? An educated guess. That's perfectly fine. And that's what you can jot down in your notes, educated guess. And the key word there is it's a guess. You don't know what's going to happen. You don't know why the sky is blue, but it's educated. You've taken the time to do a little bit of research, and you think you have an idea of what's going on. Now, with a hypothesis, this is basically the rough draft for your experiment, because every hypothesis has to have 2 parts to it. And when we have a hypothesis, hypotheses are written in what's called an if-then statement. For every hypothesis, it should have 2 parts. The if part tells the reader what your experiment is going to be. The then part tells the reader what your predicted outcome is going to be. So a classic example, if I put my foot on the brake, then the car will stop. If I put my foot on the brake, tells the reader, this is what my experiment is going to be. Then the car will stop, tells my reader what I think the outcome is going to be. Now, a hypothesis does not have to say if and then, as long as it has these two parts to it. So as you can see here, there's the example about brine shrimp. Brine shrimp will hatch at a higher rate in motor oil. Well, there's no if or then words in that sentence, but there's still an if part and there's still a then part. In the case of this one, the if part tells the reader, okay, what am I going to do? Well, in this experiment, I'm going to put brine shrimp in motor oil. That's my if part. So the reader knows this is the experiment I'm going to do. My then part is I think they're going to hatch at a higher rate. So a hypothesis will always have these two parts. The first part tells you what the experiment is going to be. The second part tells you what the outcome, what you think, your guess as what the outcome is going to be. And so remember, with a hypothesis, it has to be able to be tested. So the next sentence here, my dog Dakota is the smartest dog ever. First of all, I didn't write this. I don't have a dog. Okay? But this is an opinion. Nowhere in here does it talk about, nowhere in here does it have anything about how am I going to test to see if my dog is the smartest of all. It's just a statement saying that I think that my dog is pretty doggone intelligent. So that is not a hypothesis. It doesn't have two parts to it. It doesn't have an if part. It doesn't have a then part. So just for some practice, these are just some examples of sentences that people have written in the past. And so the first one, if you'll notice, the two ones go together. Plants will grow better when given Miracle-Gro, or plants will grow taller when given Miracle-Gro. These are both hypotheses, and these both have an if part, and they both have a then part. But one of these is a better option than the others. So when you look at this one is the better hypothesis. In both cases, the if part is I'm going to put plants in Miracle-Gro. And then obviously the then part is what happens to these plants in Miracle-Gro. But the term better is not exactly the best word to use, because when you say better, what does that mean? Are the plants going to grow taller? Are the plants going to grow more leaves? Are the plants going to have a better color? Are the plants going to make more flowers? The term better is too broad. It's too general. So we have to narrow it down. So that's why the second, the plants will grow taller when given Miracle-Gro, works better. Again, I did not write these. These are questions. This PowerPoint is one that we've used in the science department for years, and we all take turns writing. And these are examples that were given on tests before. But the next one says girls are smarter than boys, which, as you know, is an opinion. There's no if part, there's no then part. But girls will score higher on math tests than boys. That can be tested. I can give a group of girls and boys a test and see who gets the better grade. Okay. Likewise, the next, I don't know whether the next number 3 didn't show up, but hermit crabs choose colorful shells over drab shells, or hermit crabs like colorful shells. Well, again, the hermit crabs choose colorful shells over drab shells is a better hypothesis. Hermit crabs like colorful shells is not a hypothesis. There's no if part. There's no experiment. In this one here, you know that I'm going to take the hermit crabs and I'm going to put them in an aquarium. And I'm going to have a bunch of different types of shells in it. And I'm going to look to see where the hermit crabs tend to go. So whenever you write a hypothesis, and you will be asked to write hypotheses throughout this course, you need to make sure that your hypothesis has an if part and it has a then part. And once you have an hypothesis, you can then do your experiment. Because in your hypothesis, you're giving the reader an idea of what your experiment is going to be about. And your experiment is an investigation that tests a hypothesis by collecting data. Now, whenever you do an experiment, there's certain things you have to have. First of all, you have to have an experimental group and you have to have a control group. The control group is the group that's used for comparison. I always think of it as this is the group you leave alone. You leave this group alone. So I am not a farmer. I don't know much about tomato plants. So if I were to plant a bunch of tomato plants, I don't know how long it takes them to grow. I don't know how long, how tall a normal tomato plant gets. So if I'm doing experiments with tomato plants, I need at least one tomato plant that I leave alone. I plant it and I let it do its thing. I don't add any extra chemicals to it. I just let it live like it would live in nature. That's my control group. The other ones that I add fertilizer to, or I change the amount of water to, or I change the kind of dirt that I plant them in, those are my experimental groups. Those are the ones that I'm experimenting on. You also have to watch what we call variables. We have what's called an independent variable, and you have what's called a dependent variable. When we look at independent variable, I always remember independent has I, starts with an I. Now the formal definition is the single factor that is changed. When you're doing an experiment, you can't experiment with a lot of different things at one time. Like you can't change the amount of water, you can't change the amount of soil, you can't give certain amounts of fertilizer. You need to pick one thing that you're going to do your experiment with. And that's what we call the independent variable. So you can think of independent as starting with an I, and you can think of it as what I do to the experiment. You can also think of that I as a number one. It's the one thing you're doing in the experiment. So going back to the Miracle-Gro, the independent variable would be the Miracle-Gro. That's what I am doing to the plants. I'm adding Miracle-Gro. Or the brine shrimp and the motor oil. The motor oil would be the independent variable. That's what I am adding to the experiment. So whatever it is that you're testing is your independent variable. And then you watch to see what happens. So we're going to see, I'm going to add fertilizer to tomato plants and I want to see how many tomatoes grow. So I'm going to sit there and I'm going to start counting tomatoes. Well, that would be the dependent variable. The dependent variable starts with a D, so you can think of it as two ways. The dependent variable is the data that you're gathering. It's how many tomatoes grow, or it's how tall the plant gets. It depends on the experiment. So the independent variable, again, starts with the letter I. So you can think of the independent variable as being what I do to the experiment, or you can also think of it as being the number one. It's the one thing you're changing in the experiment. The dependent variable is the result. It's the data you're gathering. It depends on the experiment itself. So taking a look at some examples here, again, hypothesis, plants will grow taller when given Miracle-Gro. So my independent variable is the factor you're changing. It's what am I doing to this experiment? I'm adding Miracle-Gro. The dependent variable is the data I'm gathering. I'm measuring the height of the plants. Now, in this experiment, it says plants A and B are given the same amount of light, water, and are stored at the same temperature. Plant A is given Miracle-Gro. So therefore, remember, plant A would be your experimental group, while plant B is your control group. I'm not adding anything extra to plant B. I'm letting it grow like it's supposed to. Now, when we do experiments, we also have things called constants. Constants are things that we make sure are the same for everything in that experiment. So in this experiment, it talks about how the plants are both given the same amount of light. Well, we have to make sure they have the same amount of light, because if one plant gets more light than the other, it's going to grow better anyway. They're both given the same amount of water. Same thing is true. If one plant's given more water than the other, it's going to grow better. They're both stored in the same temperature. They're probably given the same kind of soil. They're probably watered the same time of day. So constants are things that you make sure stay the same throughout. So don't get constants and controls mixed up. Now, once we have our hypothesis and we set up our experiment, we'll start gathering data. And when we talk about data, there's actually two types, quantitative and qualitative. Well, you all know when you think of the word quantity, those are numbers. So anytime you're counting something or you're measuring something or you're taking the temperature, you have quantitative data. So in this case, we are measuring the height of the plant. Well, qualitative data are descriptions. So I might be talking about how the plant looks, or the plant seems to have gotten darker in color, or the plant seems to have made more flowers. Those are examples of descriptions. So we have quantitative data and we have qualitative data. In a lot of experiments, you'll do both. Now, when you're doing your experiment, the next thing is analyze the data. And this is where you kind of get your data organized. If you just jotted down a bunch of numbers on a piece of paper and handed me that piece of paper, I would have no clue what that means. The saying, a picture says 1,000 words, is true when it comes to experiments. A lot of experiments use quantitative data. It's numbers, it's measurements. And so if you were just to hand me a bunch of numbers, I'd be like, okay, what does this mean? Or if you were just to jot down your numbers, you might get them out of order, or okay, what order did they go in, which was which? So we come up with pictures. We use data tables. Data tables is basically this nice orderly way of listing your numbers. Well, I'm a picture person. If you give me a data table, I can see the numbers and I can see that some numbers are higher than the other, but I don't see a pattern. So that's why a lot of times we'll turn our numbers, we'll turn our data tables into graphs, because graphs show me a pattern. I can see when something's rising, I can see very easily when something's falling, I can see a zero correlation. A lot of times with a data table, I can just see a bunch of numbers, but it doesn't show me a picture in my head. So we take that and we turn that into a graph. Qualitative data, basically you're telling me what you see. Like, I observed the dog and this is what the dog did for the day. Or you give me a picture showing me, what the dissection that you did look like once you cut the eyeball open, for example. So when we just keep in mind our graphing rules. Okay? Whenever you analyze data and you make a graph, okay, the independent variable always goes on the bottom. And the dependent variable always goes on the top. So if we're talking about, or it always goes on the y-axis. If we're talking about Miracle-Gro, we are going to give that plant Miracle-Gro, and we are measuring how tall it gets. Well, that's over time. Most of the, no pun intended, most of the time will be on your x-axis, because I control how many days I let that plant grow. I'm adding Miracle-Gro to it, and I'm going to let it grow for 2 weeks. And every day, I measure how tall it is. So I'm looking for the height. The height is going to go on the y-axis. So when we have our graphs, it allows us to form pictures which makes it easier to figure out what's going on. Because then we can come up with our conclusion. We've got our data, we can see our pictures, we can see their patterns, and it allows us to review our data. And we say whether our hypothesis is supported or rejected. Notice we do not talk about a hypothesis being true or false, because nature evolves, nature changes. We say our hypothesis was supported. That means my guess looks like it's correct. Or if I got something totally different than what I thought, my hypothesis is rejected. We never, ever, 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 ever say a hypothesis is true or say a hypothesis is false. Because remember, this was a guess, right? And nature is going to change. So for example, you might have a car, and for 20 years, every time you put your foot on that brake, it stops. And then one day you put your foot on the brake and it doesn't stop. Nature's the same way. Nature is going to change. So a hypothesis that has been supported for years might one day change because of something that's happened in the atmosphere. So when we talk about a hypothesis, we say they're supported or they're rejected. And once we come up with our conclusions and we talk about what happened and this is why I think it happened, you then retest and submit. This is why, for example, it takes so long for drug companies to come up with new drugs. This is why it takes so long for the COVID vaccine example. We have to test it and test it and test it over and over and over and over and over and over again to get as much data as possible. Which then leads me to these things called theories and laws. Now, they go in order: hypothesis, theory, law. Remember, hypothesis is a natural guess, or excuse me, it's an educated guess. Well, if you get in a hypothesis and every time you do the experiment, you get the same answer over and over and over again. So every time you do the experiment, your hypothesis is supported. Well, we consider that hypothesis now to be a theory. So an explanation of natural phenomenon that's supported by a large body of scientific evidence. Basically, a theory is a hypothesis that you always get the same answer for. So if I put my foot on the brakes, then the car will stop. That's a theory, because for 20 years you put your foot on the brakes and it stops. You get the same answer every time. These are not proven, because again, something could come along in nature that causes this to change. We have what's called the cell theory in biology. The cell theory states that all living things are made from cells. Cells are the smallest unit of life, and you have to have a cell to make new cells. Well, something could come along in nature to prove us wrong. Like, where did the first cell come from? I have a theory why John broke up with Izzy. Is not really a theory. Hypotheses are guesses that we use to fuel or run an experiment. If we do the experiment over and over and over and over and over again, and we get the same answer every time, that theory is now considered, that hypothesis is now considered to be a theory. We also have in science things called laws. Laws are proven. Laws will never, ever change. Laws are true no matter where I go in the universe. Laws tend to be math-based. For example, we have Sir Isaac Newton's law of gravity. F equals ma. Force equals mass times acceleration is another law. There's gas laws. When we look at a law, it doesn't matter if I'm doing it on Earth, if I'm doing it on the moon, if I do it on Venus. It always works the same. So hopefully now you have a better idea of what we call the scientific method. Oh, here's my thing about the law.